Okay, this lesson is one of the most important lessons, maybe the most important lesson during the unit on the presidency. And the reason is because informal powers can come up during a concept application essay where you're reading about a president, what action they're doing, and it might be that they're using an informal power. It could come up during an argumentative essay about presidential powers, and the actions of a president. You have to argue one side or the other. So this is just something. It may come up in multiple choice questions. So the point is that this is a really, really critical, idea. This idea of informal powers. Now, an informal power is a power that it's not actually listed in the Constitution. It's something that has happened, and the powers of the presidency have expanded maybe beyond what the Constitution originally gave the president. So these powers mostly are things that are more recent, more modern in the last 100 years or so, and they've kind of grown over time. All right, so let's look at the. First, we're going to list them, and then we're going to have cards on each of them to kind of talk about them a little bit more. All right, so one of them is, we're not going to do a card on this one. We'll do a card on the other three. But one of them is just bargaining and persuasion. That's an informal power. Some presidents are better at bargaining for deals and making persuasive arguments, and some than the others. Others are terrible at it, and some are great at it. And this has been known as the bully pulpit from Teddy Roosevelt. And a pulpit has the idea of a preacher standing up there, convincing you of something. And so the idea of a bully pulpit is that the president is going to get up there and they're going to make a speech, and that speech can change the opinions of the American people. And then Congress responds to the American people's views. So bully pulpit, bargaining and persuasion, and informal power. Another one that is it's called an executive agreement. And again, we're going to have a card on this. So, but this is an agreement between two countries that doesn't require Senate approval. And if you look at this study from the University of Michigan, these type of informal executive agreements between nations, about 50% of international agreements were executive agreements between 1839 and 1889. But from 1939 to 1989, almost all, like 84% were executive agreements. So a huge number. All right, executive orders are an order to an executive department or a bureau to act to enforce a law. So this doesn't change the law passed by Congress, but it interprets how it's going to be enforced. So we'll talk more about executive orders. We'll do a card on it, but these have the force of law. The problem with an executive order is that one president can pass one and the next one can just rescind it and get rid of it, because one president puts in and one can take away, because it's just an order. It's not an actual law passed by Congress. This is an example. Trump's new executive order restricts asylum at the U.S.-Mexican border. So the Trump administration, this is from 2018, and so a new policy change effective Saturday that changes asylum requests in the U.S. Asylum means like you come to the U.S. and you say, I fear for my life, and so I want to be able to stay. So it allows you to go outside the normal immigration process where you have to wait in line until the U.S. tells you you can come. And it is now determined that asylum seekers can only request asylum at a U.S. port of entry. So what were happening is that people were coming across mostly the southern border, and they were crossing at places they weren't supposed to cross at, and then they would go and ask for asylum. Well, now the Trump administration is saying that if you want asylum, you must come to a port of entry only. If you go the other way, then that is just illegally crossing. That's an example of an executive order. All right, a signing statement is when a president signs a bill into law, but then says how they will interpret it. And they might even say in the signing statement, like, I'm going to think that this part of the bill, just not really, I disagree with this. I'm not going to really do it. And so they're saying what they're going to enforce and how they're going to enforce it. Now, remember, the next president could come in and interpret it differently. So it's not a permanent address. And that's the thing about informal powers. None of them are permanent. Remember that. If it's informal, it's not permanent, and the next president can literally overrule all of them. All right, now those are the informal powers. Now we're going to have a card on the bottom three. All right, so 2.41 executive orders. 2.41 executive orders. This is huge because presidents pass a lot of these. Remember, this is about how you enforce law, and it's an order to the executive branch. All right, so it's a presidential order to the executive branch. A presidential order to the executive branch. At any time if I'm going too fast, of course, pause. It does carry the force of law. It does carry the force of law. Now remember, the next president could just get rid of it. So Trump's asylum law, a president who comes after him could just say, no, you can ask for asylum anywhere in the United States. It doesn't matter. Now, what the question is, what if someone doesn't like an executive order? Okay, well, one, the next president could get rid of it. All right, that's one thing. But there actually is a more practical reason if you don't like a order that a president puts out. And this happens all the time. And that is you can sue. You can sue in court. The Supreme Court of the United States, or as we call it, SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States can rule an executive order unconstitutional. So this is a very common thing. Almost every single year, multiple times a year, the Supreme Court will rule on an executive order, whether it's constitutional or not by a president. So executive orders, whereas you could sue on a law by Congress as well. It's actually much more likely that people sue about an executive order than actually get a constitutional, unconstitutional ruling on a law passed by Congress. But of course that's possible too. All right, cool. So you always can sue. All right, next 2.42 executive agreement. An executive agreement. I already mentioned an executive agreement is between two executives of two countries. So an agreement between two nations. So a president negotiates with another foreign leader, a prime minister or president of that country, and then they have an agreement. However, it doesn't have to go to the Senate. So it's an international agreement between the president and another country, an international agreement between the president and another country that does not require consent of the Senate. This is an informal expansion of presidential power, just like executive orders. That's an expansion of presidential power. It does not require consent of the Senate. However, Congress does have power because whatever the president comes up with, Congress could just defund it. You know what? We're taking money away from that, Mr. President. Sorry. Okay, so that's something that the Senate can do. They can defund. Just some examples of this. If you want to write these down, you can. If not, it's fine. But an example is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program with Britain. Like, we're going to lend you, quote unquote, tanks or planes, mostly planes, during World War II, and you will lease us bases in the Caribbean or something. That's an example of executive agreement. It didn't require, it wasn't a treaty. It was just a kind of a deal between executives. Almost every overseas military base is an executive agreement. So we have bases in Japan, Germany, all kinds of different places, right? South Korea. All of them are basically executive agreements. The Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, which was between a huge number of countries. President Obama signed into the Paris Climate Agreement. He did not send it to the Senate because it wouldn't pass the Senate. And the Paris Climate Agreement called for the United States to have regulations that would reduce carbon emissions by a certain amount. But because the Senate wouldn't pass it, he just made it an executive agreement. Now, once President Trump came in office, he rescinded it. So, that's the problem. If you go around making executive agreements, the next president can just undo them. So it's much better to try to get a treaty passed that's formalized, and then, it's more permanent. All right, signing statement 2.43. Signing statement 2.43. Signing statement. Now, this is signing as in signing a law. Signing a law. So it's something that the president says when they sign the law about how they're going to interpret it. This has been growing fairly rapidly in recent modern times here. All right, so it's an informal presidential power. Already said that. Informal. I love the cartoon down below. It says generic signing statement, and then the president is signing it with, I am above the law. So, Congress passes a law. President, you are supposed to enforce it. But then in a signing statement, the president's saying, I am going to enforce the law, but the way I want to. So this tells Congress and the public how a president administration intends to interpret a law. And that has to do with the enforcement of that law. And they may say in the signing statement, we're going to ignore Article 5 of the law because we think this is unconstitutional or I disagree with it. And then why would a president do this? Because politically, it would look bad if they vetoed the entire law. So if they veto the entire bill, then politically they might get punished for it. So what they do is they have a signing statement saying, I'm going to sign the bill into law, but this part I don't like. Um, so they express their intention not to enforce parts of legislation they consider to be unconstitutional or otherwise provide an interpretation of the law as executive branch agency would be directed to enforce it. So, matter of fact, James Monroe was the first president ever to use a signing statement. So this has been around for a while, but it's been growing in usage in more recent years. All right, awesome. Those are informal powers. You need to know these really well, be able to describe them, be able to write them out. Be in writing, you need to be able to describe accurately what these are. So you need to practice that skill of writing these out. So make sure you do that with your whiteboard. All right, thanks, guys.